Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Professor Goldin, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans
great
channel,
pleasure.
and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, there are many things that I would like to talk to you about, but let's start with the most current issues. So now the Trump administration has slapped tariffs on friends and foes alike. You're somebody who has been dealing with development, good governance, trade and commerce. What do you make of these tariffs? What exactly is the Trump administration aiming to achieve, and what are the possible repercussions of these?
I think it's terrible. They're destroying a system that they helped build over the last 80 years in the post-Second World War period. It will be very bad for the US economy. President Trump calls it a medicine, but it's more like a poison that they're administering to themselves. And it'll be very bad for the world. And he's particularly discriminating against poorer countries. So we're seeing that the Global South has much higher tariffs, and some very poor countries have very high tariffs. It's a complete failure to understand what trade is about, what economics is about. I would fail a junior student if they propose something like this, because it's just very bad economics. It's going to be bad politically as well. It's undermining the global system. It's building mistrust and tension. And that means that the potential to solve other global problems, to slow climate change, to stop the next pandemic, to do the things we have to do to create a more equal world, are also going to be undermined. So it's very undermining, and it raises the potential, I think, for conflict as well.
Right, but could it be that President Trump and his entire administration is being ill-advised or surrounded by bad economic advisors, or does he have a long-term plan in his head?
Well, I think both, in that it's very bad advice to achieve something which they want to achieve, which is create jobs in the US, to try and support his MAGA base. But this is precisely the wrong way to go about it. What it's going to do, it's going to slow US growth, it's going to increase costs, and it's going to slow job creation in the US. So the consequences of this will be the opposite, I think, of what is intended, which is job creation and supporting people's incomes. We will see inequality rise, and we will see job losses and people suffering from higher prices as a result of this.
Right. Now let's go back to something, let's view the whole situation from a broader perspective, I mean, 20 to 30 years ago, we've been speaking a lot about globalization, I want to start by asking you, how do you view the current state of globalization, and is the world leaning towards greater integration, or are we witnessing a retreat from interconnectedness in light of these recent geopolitical and economic shifts?
I think the majority of the world is moving to closer integration, driven largely by Asia, and that is going to be half of the world economy, half of the world's population.
Very soon, right?
Very soon, over the next 15 years or so. And if you look at the flows in that region, the investment flows, the trade flows, the technology flows, the ideas flows, they're accelerating. So globalization is alive and well and living in Asia. Europe is also very integrated. Montenegro and other countries want to join Europe, so we should see closer integration in Europe as well.
But it's an aging continent.
It's aging, but I can come to that separately. But on the question of globalization, it's really the US which is deglobalizing or trying to deglobalize. Of course, you can deglobalize from trade, you can deglobalize from investment and from ideas, which is what they're doing. But you can't deglobalize from the risks. Climate change will impact on the US, whether it tries to create walls or not. Next pandemic will impact on the US, whether it wants to create higher walls or not. And so what the US will find is that it's integrated with the world but has less control. Because the global institutions are less effective, and it's less present in the global institutions that try and manage the risks of globalization. So I think globalization will transform. It was transforming anyway.
Yeah.
This will accelerate the transformation.
Now, I mean, you've often highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent to globalization. Now, what systemic risks do you think pose perhaps the greatest threats to global stability today? And how can, policymakers, we have heard many of them speak at the ESG Asia Summit in Montenegro these days, how can they properly address them effectively?
Well, the greatest risks are, I think, well known. Climate change is certainly an existential risk. Oceans will rise, extreme weather will become more frequent, and indeed the temperatures in Europe might change rather radically through changing currents in the North Atlantic. So this needs to be done through collective action. Even if the US government wants to withdraw, states and cities and businesses in the US that account for over 80% of emissions in the US can still commit to net zero. Pandemic remains a massive threat. I think the risk of a pandemic is greater now than it was in 2019. I predicted the pandemic. And that's because there are more and more people in more places, more connected, closer to animals, but also because the global institutions that are meant to stop pandemics, notably the World Health Organization, has been undermined by the US withdrawing from the World Health Organization.
Effectively, yep.
In the US, vaccinations are going down because of very strange health. The National Institute of Health is being undermined. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is being undermined in the US. And this means that the risk of pandemic is rising. So we certainly will see another pandemic. It's just a question of when and what form it will take and where it might originate. It could originate in a rich country lab or the poorest country in the world. And then there are other risks, and conflict, of course, is never far away. I think we're less likely to see peaceful resolution of conflicts because of these rising tensions and because the US is withdrawing from the system. So I think conflict remains a great risk.
Do you expect more conflicts to erupt as a result of, the fight for, perhaps renewed fights for, very scarce resources in Africa, in Asia, perhaps even for rare earth minerals in Central Asia?
I think the argument that people fight over rare resources is overplayed.
Yeah.
There's actually not much historical evidence that this is what source for. In fact, it tends to lead to cooperation. That's what trade is about. That's why trade happens, because some people have resources that others don't. It might be cheap labor, it might be cheap minerals or whatever. But it's also the case that on many shared resources that there's cooperation on it. So we haven't seen much conflict over resources. That people talk about the Gulf War as a fight over oil, but was it really? And in this region, what were the conflicts about? Were they resources conflicts, or were they other conflicts based on other reasons? So I think it will add to the tensions, and it can become a source of tension if the US wants it to be and talks about it. But it could also be exactly the opposite. It could be a way of ensuring that we trade more, that we cooperate more. And I think that's certainly the case on water, for example, which is a very scarce resource. We've seen that water over many countries, like the Nile River, the Indus River, Pakistan, India, for example, these can become the form of cooperative agreements, but they can be undermined by governments that want to be nationalistic. Now,
we have heard, the United Nations over the last 20 to 30 years really set the bar quite high for various development and sustainability goals to be achieved by 2030. And we are getting very close to that year. Are we on track to meet any of these goals? And I mean, we've heard many people talk about the, private-public partnerships at the conference, at the ESG summit. What role should private-public partnerships play in accelerating this progress?
Unfortunately, we're not on track. I was at many of these summits. I was head of policy for the World Bank Group and vice president there, so very involved in this process. And in 2006, we had this idea of make poverty history.
Yes.
That seems like a distant dream now. Unfortunately, we had massive achievement. We could have achieved the goals if the world cooperated, but now we've been derailed. And poverty is increasing again, extreme poverty is increasing.
Derailed why exactly?
Well, I think the financial crisis was really the first big shock to the system.
So we're talking about 2008, 2009, yeah.
Exactly. The euro crisis in Europe, but it had global ripples.
Exactly.
COVID-19 was a very, very big setback. It increased extreme poverty. But also aid now has been cut. The USAID has been cut dramatically. The aid amongst the Europeans has been cut. And of course, higher tariffs. Businesses need to trade their way out of poverty in poor countries. And if you have big imposition of tariffs and free trade agreements are being torn up, that becomes much more difficult. So I think it's been a variety of reasons. World Health Organization, very important in achieving the health SDGs, for example. So there's a variety of reasons that it's been derailed. The role of business, I think, is to keep it alive. I hope that businesses in this region do not do what businesses in the US are doing, which is, you get up on the Davos stage 1 year and you say, I'm committed to climate change, I'm committed to diversity of my workforce, and then overnight you clean this all off your website and you revert back to the bad old days. We need to now double down on these things, I think, in Europe, and it's important that business continues its commitment, I think, to sustainability here at the ESG Summit. It's very important, and it's great to hear the number of businesses that are saying that. It's very encouraging. But it's important not just for the shareholders, but the stakeholders more broadly, that this is maintained.
All right. We've seen how emerging technologies such as AI and automation have the potential to transform the way industries and societies function. What policy measures do you think are necessary to ensure that technological progress doesn't really exacerbate existing inequalities?
There's many things that need to be done.
Such as?
Well, the first thing is that the new jobs are in different places to the old jobs. And one of the reasons we have this polarization in politics across Europe, but also in the US, is that the new jobs are very difficult to get to for people. They cannot afford the housing in the new places. So why do people get stuck in the past? It's often the housing market which is a problem. So making housing markets work more effectively. Transport is important. School places, elderly care. These are reasons people are unable to go to where the new jobs are. Skills and education, retraining are vital as well. So when the world changes more rapidly and technology changes more rapidly, and it is, then people need to be able to change jobs. They need to be able to reskill and go to new places. And the great failure has been that people are stuck with their old skills in old places. Then they get angry because they don't see a future for themselves or their children. And that's why I believe this requires a system-wide change. And it has to happen very urgently to stop the rise of populism.
A system which will teach the existing workforce new skills necessary for the future, or?
Partly, but also allow them to move to new. You can have a skill, but you can't afford to go to where the job is. Also, we need more housing in dynamic places. We need more affordable housing. We need transport that allows us to commute over longer distances more quickly and affordably. We need to be able to get our kids into school. There are lots of different things that need to come together to go to the new places. We need flexibility, but also we need to accept that some people are unlikely to get those sorts of jobs, and then we need to also provide a safety net in our societies which gives people a decent life even if they can't get the jobs.
Right, but should these initiatives come from the government or from the private sector?
In the end, it's the private sector that creates jobs. Yeah. It's the private sector that has much more money to invest, and governments are all very cash-strapped. But the initiative needs to come from government as well. The guidelines, the rules and regulations, and the understanding of what the system-wide issues are, I believe this is a government imperative. Right,
but now when you say that the government should have a safety net in place for those who can't really afford new housing and cover their commuting costs, bearing in mind how much money is being allocated for defense these days, that's quite unlikely to happen.
Well, we have to decide what our priorities in our societies are, and I agree with the added expenditure on defense. But, taxes are at record low levels. There's been a race to the bottom in taxation, and that's one of the negative aspects of globalization, the creation of offshore tax havens and islands and competition between countries on tax. We need to understand that we all have a responsibility to create fairer societies. And so I think a fair tax burden, where some people do not escape entirely by offshoring and enjoying the benefits, for example, is part of that. So yes, and we need to question the question, at what level of debt are we prepared to tolerate? If you're investing in the future in productive growth, I believe societies can tolerate higher levels of debt.
you worked at the World Bank before, and do you believe that global institutions such as the United Nations and the World Bank are equipped to manage the complexities of today's interconnected challenges? And do you see structural changes, reforms, as being necessary to enhance their effectiveness?
Yes, the international system is totally unfit for 21st century purposes. The Bretton Woods institutions, so the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, are better than the UN system. Yeah. They have better paid staff who've got higher levels of skill typically. But all of them need reform. I was on Kofi Annan's UN Reform Task Force, so I was in the kitchen trying to sort out the spaghetti bowl.
There was a lot of obstruction to that, right?
Very few of our recommendations were implemented. You cannot blame the institutions for the failure to implement the reforms. You have to blame the shareholders. It's like a private company, right, where you blame the board, not the CEO, if things go badly off track. And it's the shareholders in the end that have responsibility for the global system. The biggest shareholders don't agree. The US, China, Europe, Russia, these are all shareholders in the global system.
So effectively the biggest funders
Well, Russia is not, but certainly the US and Europe are, yes, followed by Japan, and China is significant. And if the shareholders don't agree, then the institution is gridlocked. And that's where we are, I'm afraid. We cannot expect the system to reform with the current structure of leadership at the shareholding level. And also, of course, the resources are very scarce, particularly because the US is withdrawing. So I'm afraid we're stuck with the system globally that we have. And then the question is, okay, given that, how do we make what exists more effective? And what else can we do? What can business do? What can civil society do? What can cities do? What can we do at a country level when we know that there's no big brother that's going to fix the system?
And now as we move towards the end of the interview, I mean, you've done a lot of work on migration. I wanted to ask you, we've seen how, especially here in the Balkans, how migration is often an opportunity, but also a challenge for smaller nations. How can countries balance the economic benefits of migration? We clearly see there are numerous benefits when it comes to innovation, the contribution to the GDP of various countries, but also political tensions that we have seen arise in Europe, in the European Union. We have seen the rise of the far right. Absolutely, and my most recent book is on migration because I'm trying to sort this out. I'm trying to think it through.
The economic perspective is very clear that migrants are beneficial, not only for economic growth and dynamism and innovation, small business creation and all of these things, but also for creating jobs domestically as well and lifting wages. So this is pretty clear in the economic evidence. The political is the opposite. People don't like migrants. Even first generation, second generation migrants don't want the next wave of migrants. So to reconcile these things, I believe we need to understand two things. The first is that a lot of the concerns of people are about their own circumstances. Affordable housing is very important. If you see other people living there, you blame them for the fact that you cannot afford to live there. How long do you have to wait for medical treatment? Get your kid into school. All of these things are very important, and addressing them is important. The places with the highest level of migration are often the most tolerant of migration. In England, London is 41% foreign-born, but is the most pro-migration. The places that are anti-migration typically have very low levels, like 5% of the population is migration. And the most successful cities globally, like Dubai, is 90% migrants. Vancouver, Melbourne, Toronto are well over half migrants. And they're the most dynamic cities, and also they rank as the happiest cities to be in. So there's no correlation between...
None at all.
None at all. But in fact, there's the opposite, that migrants create dynamic cities, and then they create a virtuous circle where more migrants come. But you have to address seriously people's concerns. And I believe we need proper conversations about how many migrants do we want, how long do they stay for, do we document all our migrants, and I believe we should. We don't want illegal people. Do they pay tax? And they should. all of these things, the responsibilities that go with migration, as well as the rights. Do we protect them? Do we give them health and safety? Do they get the minimum wage? Or are they undercutting people? This needs to be part of a package where we have more migrants. They have responsibilities, tax, documentation, legality, and they have rights as well.
Right, Professor, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank
Great
you so much
pleasure
for your time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?